chaps and chapettes, welcome back to the Discerning Gamer. How you been? Good news, Relic have announced that Dawn of War 3 is going into open beta between the 21st and 24th of April. I put a link to sign up in the description. I'm really glad that they've decided to put their money where their mouth is, so to speak, by letting people get their hands on the multiplayer part of the game before parting with their precious and shiny coins. The pre-release news cycle for Dawn of War 3 has been full of controversy and contentious design decisions for the game, and I think this move shows that Relic are actually confident in their choices and the product that they're delivering, and they're not trying to bushwhack the community by riding on the coattails of the other entries in the franchise. Unlike Mass Effect Andromeda. Ooh, sick burn! So, we can all look forward to getting our grubby mitts on the game and making our minds up once and for all based on our experience of actually playing it. And though obviously it's been hailed as a beta, in inverted commas, at this point it's just kind of like a popular term so that people know it's like a, exclusive pre-release chance to play the game. It's pretty safe to say that with the beta being the weekend before its release, the following Friday, the code that we're going to get in the beta is going to be exactly the same thing that goes gold the following week. It also looks like it's getting a bit late in the day for the announcement of a fourth race, so even though I'm still convinced that we're going to be seeing Necron involvement in the single player section of the game, see my previous videos for info on that, it doesn't look like we're going to be getting a force race for multiplayer at launch. Honestly, this won't stop me from picking up the game, provided that it's good, but I do think it's a bit cheap and out of character for Relic to limit this game to 3 series, considering that every other series in the game has started with 4 playable races for multiplayer. Then again, if the game is actually good and it sells well, then we can be sure that we're going to be getting expansions or some form of DLC to add additional races and more playable content, and if the game's good and has a good long shelf life, then all will be forgiven in the long run, I suppose. So, on to the other topic that I wanted to cover in this video. I recently read an article over on the Wayward Strategist that Relic linked from their Facebook page. I've put a link to the article in the description. It's very good, definitely worth a read. The blog's author, Brandon Castile, interviewed Dawn of War 3's game director, Philippe Boule, and the interview for me was really illuminating and actually quite encouraging for the prospect of Dawn of War 3, when I feel like there's been a lot of potential uncertainty and tricky design choices made for the game. It went a long way to explaining and justifying a lot more of the controversial design choices in Dawn of War 3, and for me it showed the value of having a veteran RTS player who actually understands in depth the game mechanics that make RTS games good, interviewing the developer. Of course, there's been loads of interviews with the developers of Dawn of War 3, but without being mean, they're by journalists that really don't know that much about RTS games or design, and they're writing for an audience who doesn't really care to delve into the intricacies too much. So I thought this interview was really worthwhile and actually gave me some good insight and hope for the game going forward. So I want to highlight a few key points from the interview and kind of give you my takeaway from what was said. Firstly, Boule talked about the changes that they've made to resource points and how they function in the game. They are now one meta point, so rather than having an individual point for requisition and an individual point for power, you can build both requisition and power on the same resource points, and also in some cases elite point generation as well. And also, they no longer passively generate resources just from being captured. You actually have to build the resource extractors on the points for them to benefit your economy. I think this is encouraging because, for me, it allows for a greater level of strategic decision making in terms of how you're actually controlling the macro for your army. So it allows you to think, okay, right, my strategy is going to be spamming out a lot of cheap early game units, so I'm going to invest in increasing my requisition income for the beginning of the game. And also that means that the person that you're fighting against can see that you've done that by scouting your resource points and, you know, react to that in some way, or even use some form of targeted hit and run harassment to deny you those resources and put a crimp in your plan. And suddenly that to me is a much more interesting bit of back and forth in the way that the resource management plays into the broader strategy and reaction between the players. Bull also makes the point that it gives more of a sense of ownership and more of an importance to map control, and it also makes more of a decision out of choosing to exploit the resources from a point, rather than just grabbing a point because it's not contested at the moment, or being able to grab a point and not defend it in order to just get some resources because your opponent's not really concentrating on that area of the map, because actually in the grander scheme of things it's not too important, as it was in Dawn of War 2, I would argue. In Dawn of War 2, a requisition point or some of the more peripheral points on the map could change hands several times over the course of a game without really being contested or guarded or it having that much significance. And I think that adding this extra layer of complexity and tactical choice into the way that resource points are being handled is actually a very positive thing. Bull also went on to comment on the new Power Core game mode, saying that it was put in to create a more energetic playstyle in the game, rather than, for example, from Dawn of War 2, one player seizing an advantage early in the game and then setting up a defense on the central victory point and just repelling the other player that way. What he wanted is something that stops snowballing so much, stops the other one player sort of sitting back and being passive while the other player has to attack. Now it's very much about both players attacking and engaging one another, and also having to lose units and building up less of an advantage to achieve the objective, rather than having, you know, perhaps one engagement where they lost some units, but then after that they've got the positional advantage and the defender's advantage constantly, and then allowing that to sort of spiral out of control with one player having a clear advantage and just waiting for the game to end. This comment about removing snowballing, or a condition where one player is kind of clearly won but we're just waiting for the victory point timer or the game to end, is a recurring theme throughout the interview, and I think it's very positive that it's something that they've considered and are trying to address. Another point that they touched on, which I thought was really interesting, was the decision to bring base building back. And Bull makes a very good point that in Dawn of War 2, the decision to remove base building took away more in the depth of the game than it added to the simplicity of the game. He talks about how putting buildings back in the mix puts more of a focus on fighting over space and the map, and also makes progression through the tech tree in the game less linear. It opens up more opportunities for proper scouting, for harassment, for strategic decisions in terms of where you're actually placing your buildings. It also opens up opportunities for harassment, and this all makes sense to me, and again indicates that we're going to be seeing a lot of base building out on the maps beyond the turrets that protect the power core. And that was one of my key concerns, actually, that base building was just going to be relegated to right at the back of the map behind the turrets that protect the power core, and that would have made it almost arbitrary, not strategically interesting, and not another place where players could show their kind of skill or finesse or understanding of the game. And I'm really glad to hear that it sounds like we're going to actually be seeing a big advantage coming from placing your buildings out on the map and making that into a point of contention or risk taking. And this might also explain why the retreat mechanic's gone, because if your units could potentially go to any number of different points out on the map to be reinforced and healed, then having a mechanic that makes them run all the way back to your base or back to one fixed point doesn't necessarily make that much sense. And also I suppose it is another place where a player who's good can make those decisions with different buildings, giving himself different options while he's out of the map. So Ball comments that having these units be slightly more disposable and having building be moved out onto the map makes the game more about controlling space rather than unit preservation. And he very astutely notes that in Dawn of War 2 it was actually all about the scarcity of units and preserving those units, and that the game being overly focused on that meant that other things like map control, scouting and harassment lost out, because whether you won or lost essentially came down to whether you were able to preserve your unit better than the other player. Just to kind of reinforce this, a direct quote from Ball is, "Originally, we weren't sure if it was going to stay, but we kept it when we saw that it created these interesting possibilities. There's a predictable risk-reward dilemma in building out on the map. You can reinforce more quickly, but you're more exposed. Writ large, the player is encouraged to play out in the battlefield and not be chained to a base, and that's what we wanted." End of quote. So the final thing that the interview really got across to me was something that I don't think has actually been covered anywhere else to the best of my knowledge, and that's the escalation phases in a multiplayer match. And it's interesting because this is something that we've actually seen introduced in the new game from Eugen Systems, Steel Division, where they have put in a mechanic that limits the units that you can take at different phases of the battle in order to give a kind of more structured pace to the way the game plays. Interestingly, I think from what I read is that this has been implemented to try and stop snowballing and try and keep the game at a more even tempo and stop one player from getting a kind of irrecoverable advantage earlier in the game and it becoming a matter of just waiting to win. Ball explains that escalation affects basically three separate things. It affects the health and firepower of objectives and listening posts. This means listening posts are easier to deal with in the early game. It also affects resource rates. Resources come in faster with each escalation phase. In the early game, the first two phases, when you lose units, you recoup some of their cost. So there's time-based advantages to killing enemy units, but it's not an irrecoverable advantage. So from what he said there, it's kind of difficult to judge exactly how this will affect the pacing of the game, other than making it so that in the early game there's more of a chance for a comeback for a player who's lost a lot of units or perhaps taken a beating. I do see it as potentially a positive thing because it simply adds another lever that the design team can pull on to help balance the game or affect the flow or pace of the game as it proceeds. Putting in refunds on unit deaths and using the mechanics to potentially soften game-ending hits in the early game may seem like it's pandering to a more casual audience, and I can see the argument for that. But as long as it doesn't stop a more skillful player from winning in the long run and seizing an advantage that's consummate to how badly they've mauled the other player, then I can see how it would work as well. And I think having something where, you know, you'll get an advantage for playing better, but you haven't completely beaten your opponent right at the beginning, you have to consistently outplay them throughout the game. That seems reasonable to me from a balancing perspective. So those are the main points I wanted to get across from the interview, and I think that because Mr. Castile is actually well versed enough in strategy games to ask these questions and interact with a games director on this level, it's actually given us a lot of insight and personally for me a lot of hope for Dawn of War. I'm interested to know what you guys think. Will you be playing the open beta, or are the aesthetic changes to the game too much to get over? With this new insight from the Wayward Strategist, can you see or begin to agree with the logic behind the design decisions that Relic have made? Let me know in the comments. The discourse over the last couple of Dawn of War 3 videos that I've made has generally been very good, and I do like the chance to see new perspectives and ideas from you guys, so kudos on that. If you enjoyed the video, please drop us a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more, and of course I always appreciate constructive feedback. I'm cooking up some new videos on Steel Division and PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, so if you'd like to see some more stuff on those, stay tuned. Until next time.